This is a dead creek in eastern Oregon, halfway between John Day and Burns. Sagebrush, dust, and a channel cut so deep the banks come up over your head. Less than 14 inches of water falls on this country in a year. The creek runs a few weeks at snowmelt, and then the ground goes hard until October. And a veterinarian named Scott Campbell has spent years hauling rock into it. Now I want you to picture that same ground, green in August, water sitting on the surface, cattle standing in grass up past their knees. That's what Campbell thought he could get to, using rock off his own hillsides. He drove a loader up the slope, filled it, and stacked the rock across the gullies in low walls about knee-high. So how does a pile of loose rock put water back into a creek that's run a few weeks a year for 200 years? To answer that, we first need to work out where this valley's water went. Pull up a map of Oregon and go to the eastern side. The Silvies River starts on the southern flank of the Aldrich Mountains, about 10 miles south of Mount Vernon at 5,600 feet. It runs south for 119 miles, past a town called Seneca, past Burns, and then splits into two forks. Both forks end at Moore Lake, and that's where the water stops. Moore Lake has no way out to the sea. When it gets high enough, it spills west into Mud Lake, and then into Harney Lake. And Harney Lake is the bottom of the entire basin. Water that falls here never reaches an ocean. It sits there and it evaporates. So there are no salmon in this country, no steelhead, nothing that swims up from the Pacific because there's no route to swim. Seneca sits right on this river. The town averages just under 14 inches of water a year. Snowfall runs to 58 inches, piling up over 26 days, and sits on the hills all winter before coming off in a rush in April. Ranching is what this country runs on. The streams feeding Moller Lake carry very little irrigation water, so a rancher out here lives on whatever falls on his own ground. Grass grows where water sits in the soil, so the water table under the meadow is the entire business. The ranch I'm talking about covers about 140,000 acres. Some of it deeded and some of it leased from the Forest Service and the BLM. Now, in the 1820s, this valley was full of beavers, and we know that because of a man named Antoine Silvale. In February 1826, Silvale was working for Hudson's Bay Company under a chief trader named Peter Sken Ogden. Ogden sent him off toward the headwaters of the Ohui and the Mulher, with orders to rejoin the main party later. Silvale didn't rejoin. He went straight back to Fort Vancouver on his own and told them he'd found the stream very rich with beaver. So picture what Silvale actually walked into. A beaver drops a line of sticks and mud across a creek, and the water backs up behind it. That pond fills with silt a little more every year. Give it a few centuries and the pond isn't a pond anymore. It's a flat green meadow with a creek threading through the middle of it. Water crosses that meadow slowly. The soil underneath stays soaked, and springs up on the hillside keep running in August because the whole valley floor is full of water. Silvale was out there under orders. The Hudson's Bay Company had one standing instruction for this region, and it came from Chief Factor John McLaughlin. Trap it empty. They wanted a fur desert, a belt of country stripped of beaver so thoroughly that American trappers pushing west out of St. Louis would ride in, find nothing worth carrying home, and turn around. Ogden ran 6 of those brigades between 1824 and 1830. He rode through Harney Valley himself in November 1826. The policy worked. The beavers went, and the beaver dam needs constant patching. Something has to be there rebuilding it every spring. With nobody rebuilding, the dams rotted and blew out, one flood at a time. Once the dam is gone, all that snowmelt has one place to go, and that's straight down. The water cut into the valley floor and started hauling out sediment that had taken centuries to build up. That's called incision. The channel dropped, and the water table dropped right along with it. Then the meadows dried out. Grass died back. Sagebrush came down off the hillsides and into the valley bottoms where the hay ground used to be, because sagebrush would take dry ground that grass had given up on, and the springs quit, one after another, because there was no water left sitting in the valley floor to feed them. Here's what that leaves you with if you own cattle. When a creek cuts down below the meadow, the soil on either side can no longer reach the water in the channel. Dry soil grows less grass. Less grass means fewer cattle on the same acres, and a shorter window to graze them before you're buying hay and trucking it in. You end up standing in a gully with dry banks over your head on ground your great-grandfather cut hay off. So if beavers built this valley, the repair looks obvious. Put the beavers back. That's exactly what Scott Campbell wanted to do. Campbell is a veterinarian. He grew up in Burns, about 45 minutes south of this valley. His grandparents ranched out here and his father was the town doctor. In 1987, he bought a single veterinarian hospital up in Portland, and in September 2007, he sold his shares to Mars and stepped down as chief executive. That same year, he took on the Silvies Valley Ranch. He bought it as a real estate investment, walked the ground, and found it in far worse shape than he'd been told. So he went looking for the reason the creeks had cut themselves into trenches, and he landed on the beavers. His position, and it's on the record with the Forest Service, is that the incision and the beaver collapse are the same event. The dams built the meadows. Lose the dams, lose the meadows. Which points at an obvious repair. Go get some beavers. Now, here's what a beaver actually needs. It eats willow. It builds with willow. It ducks under willow when a coyote comes down the bank, so before you release a single animal, you need willow standing along the creek. There was no willow in these bottoms. Willow grows where the soil stays wet, and the soil went dry when the channel cut down. The channel cut down because the dams failed. The dams failed because the beavers were gone. So the animal that repairs the valley needs the exact thing the damage destroyed. Turn a beaver loose in a dry gully full of sagebrush and it starves or it walks. Campbell kept the dam and dropped the beaver. Let me walk you through what he actually built. He drove a loader up into his own hillside and pulled rock and gravel straight out of the slope. Some dirt, some logs, nothing bought, nothing trucked in, no quarry invoice. The material was already sitting on the property. Then he stacked it across the gully. Across, not along. A low wall running from one bank to the other, roughly knee height, sitting square in the path of the water. You could step over most of them without breaking stride. The next time the creek runs, water comes down the channel, hits the rock and stops. It backs up. It spreads sideways across the ground that hasn't been wet in decades, and it sits there. And because that wall is loose rock instead of poured concrete, the water works its way through the gaps between the stones, comes out the far side, and keeps going downstream. Slowly, a trickle instead of a flood. So the ranch below still gets its water. The wall holds the flow back without shutting anybody off. Then he built another one upstream, and another one above that, spaced out along the channel, one every so many yards, all the way up the draw, a whole staircase of them down one valley. So the pool behind each wall runs into the next. Stand back, and one of these looks like the rock road crossings already scattered over every ranch in the county. Before the rock went in, snowmelt hit the gully, ran, and was gone in an afternoon, straight out the bottom of the valley. Now, it hits a wall, then another one below that, then another. Every wall holds it a little longer, and water that's standing still on a meadow does one thing. It soaks in. That was the theory, anyway. He had no permit, no engineer, and no evidence it would do anything at all. So he picked one creek to try it on, Camp Creek, a stream on the ranch that runs down into the Silvies. He built more than 100 rock dams along 3.5 miles of it. Before he started, the valley bottom was dry sagebrush and juniper. Same brush, same dust, same color as the hillside above it. Walk down off the slope into the bottom and nothing changed under your boots. Then the water table came up. Water backed up behind each wall and soaked down into the ground on both sides of the channel. And grass came back on its own. Nobody seeded it, nobody watered it, nobody hauled in a single sack of anything. The native grass that used to grow on these bottoms just came up because the seed had been sitting in that soil the whole time, waiting for water to show up. The sagebrush went the other way. Sagebrush wants dry ground, and its roots were now sitting in wet soil, so it drowned. It died back across the bottom, and the grass filled in behind it, until the valley floor was a green meadow with a creek running through the middle of it, and the springs came back. The ones that had been dry when the water table dropped started running through the summer again. Because there was water sitting burrowing in the valley floor to feed them. Then 15. A controlled burn on a ranch got away during peak fire season and ran. It scorched more than 5,000 acres. Fire needs dry fuel to move. It runs on dead grass, sage, and juniper. The fire came down the hill toward Camp Creek and reached the bottom of the valley. And it stopped there. The fire couldn't get across the wet meadow because there was nothing down there dry enough to carry it. It sat at the edge and burned itself out. The buildings on the far side never caught. Nobody had built the dams for that. They built them for grass. Colby Marshall runs the livestock on the ranch. Here's what changed in the cattle operation. They cut hay off those bottoms in late spring, bale it, and haul it into the yard for winter feed. They turn cattle onto that same ground and graze it into late summer. That's 2 uses out of 1 piece of dirt in a single season, on ground that had been barely worth fencing. The ranch also stopped taking water out of the river. Hay needs moisture in early summer. Normally, you pour that out of the stream and run it through a ditch onto your own field, but the rock walls had put so much water into the soil over the spring that the hay grew on soil moisture alone. So Campbell left the river alone in June. He let it go past, which means the ranchers downstream got more water than they're used to, and they noticed. The rock slowed the spring runoff down long enough to be worth something, then let it carry on. The Forest Service put researchers on the ranch and wrote it up as a case study. Their record of it is that the dams reconnected the streams to their floodplains. The water in the channel and the water in the soil on either side of it are in contact again, the way they were before the creek cut down, and the wet meadows got bigger, and the grass growing on them got better to eat. The cattle grazed exactly where they'd always grazed. Nobody moved a fence, opened a new pasture, or changed a rotation. Same animals, same places, more grass underneath them. He decided to do it everywhere. Over the next 10 years, ranch crews put another 160 rock dams into 4 different creeks that feed the Sylvies. 91 of them went into Flat Creek, 33 into Jack Andy Creek, 26 into Payne Creek, 10 into Jump Creek, and nobody ever asked the government for permission to build a single one. Now, normally that's a serious problem. If you want to drop rock into a stream in the United States, you go to the Army Corps of Engineers first and you get a federal permit. The Corps has authority over what the law calls waters of the United States, and that authority comes out of the Commerce Clause. So the test is whether your creek connects to a navigable interstate waterway. This water never crosses the state line, and it never reaches an ocean. It evaporates. So the Army Corps of Engineers has no claim here at all. That leaves the state. These creeks are the waters of the state of Oregon, and Oregon runs its own permit program through the Department of State Lands, under what's called the Removal Fill Law. Move material into a waterway or take material out of one, and you need their permit first. And Campbell's argument was that he didn't need one. The state's own guidance at the time pointed at 2 categories of stream: permanent streams that flow year-round, and seasonal streams carrying anadromous fish, which means salmon and steelhead, fish that run up from the ocean to spawn. There are no anadromous fish in the Hanley Basin. There's no route from the sea to get here, and Camp Creek, before he touched it, ran for a few weeks a year. Snowmelt came down, the gully carried it out, and then it was moist sand until the following spring. No permanent flow, no fish. On the state's own 2 tests, that creek sat outside the permit rules. Then he stacked the rock. And according to PERC, a research organization in Montana that wrote up the ranch, Camp Creek started running year-round and filled with fish, several species of them, in a channel that had been desert wash most of the year. So before the work, the creek was seasonal and no permit was required. After the work, the creek was permanent and held fish, and a permit was required. If the rock had done nothing, he'd have been fine. The rock worked, so he was in violation. PERC's argument is that the restoration created the exact condition that made it illegal. That's their framing of it, and it's a legal argument rather than a ruling. Here's what the state of Oregon actually did. The Department of State Lands opened an enforcement action against the ranch, and that action required Sylvies Valley Ranch to sit down and produce a document called a Remedial Action Plan, worked out jointly with the Department of State Lands and with the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife. That plan had to cover two things. The first was fish passage. A rock dam is a wall across a creek. A fish swimming upstream hits it and stops. So Oregon law says that if a waterway holds native migratory fish, you give those fish a way past your structure, build a ladder, notch the wall, or take the structure out. And the law goes further than that. It also covers any waterway that historically held native migratory fish, even if there are none in it today. So a creek that had trout in it a century ago still triggers that rule. If you can't provide passage, you apply for a formal exemption, and every single structure needs its own answer. The second thing the plan had to cover was wetlands. Building without a permit had to fill into wetland ground, and that impact had to be addressed through mitigation. Mitigation means you make up the loss somewhere else, by restoring or protecting wetland acres to balance the ones you affected. So the ranch filed for fish passage exemptions, 160 of them, one application per dam. That's 160 separate pieces of paper, each one arguing that a specific rock wall on a specific creek should be allowed to stay where it sits. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife opened it up for public comment through October 14th, 2019, and carried the whole thing to the Fish Passage Task Force in Salem on October 18th. And the grounds for exemption request cut against the story you'd expect. The argument was that restoring fish passage on these four creeks would deliver no appreciable benefit, and ODFW's own analysis backed that up. Their finding was that Flat Creek, Jack Andy Creek, Payne Creek, and Jump Creek historically held native migratory fish, but that today they support no red-band trout and no other native migratory fish. So on those four creeks, there were no fish to pass. Camp Creek is the one that filled with fish, and that difference is what the exemption requests rested on. The Sylvies River itself does hold red-band trout, particularly on its higher reaches, but that's the mainstream. So on Flat, Jack Andy, Payne, and Jump, the rock brought back grass and meadow and water that runs all year. It did not bring back trout. PERC also reports that the Campbells paid penalties for the earlier work they'd done without a permit. No amount has ever been made public, and no date either, and the law that caught him was written for a different problem. Oregon's removal fill law exists because developers drain wetland to build on them, and gravel outfits mine stream beds. The statute went on the books to stop that, and the statute can't read intent. It reads material placed in a waterway without a permit, and it applies the same test to a man restoring a meadow as it does to a company filling one in. Campbell put more than 250 rock structures into waterways over roughly a decade without ever filing a piece of paper. So once the state opened the file, the argument stopped being about whether the rock worked and started being about which box the creek belonged in. Meanwhile, the rock kept working. And Oregon does have a legal route for this now. Voluntary habitat restoration that moves less than 50 cubic yards is exempt from the removal fill permit, so long as you file notice 30 days ahead and build with materials that would naturally occur at that site. In 2021, the legislature added another exemption, this one for certain voluntary stream restoration projects. Campbell kept working the problem from his own end. He went to Salem, he pushed for legislation, and he started showing other ranchers how to build the structures. The Forest Service sent researchers out to write the ranch up as a case study, so the method sits published where anyone can find it. Ranchers nearby had started putting rock in their own creeks. One of them, out past Paulina, tracked the Campbells down and asked them one question. How do you get restoration work through the permitting process? Go out to Flat Creek in August. The rock walls are still sitting there, low and grey, running bank to bank. Water is backed up behind each one, working its way through the gaps, and the cattle are standing in green grass.